Congressman Gary Palmer is kind enough to join us this afternoon to talk about a couple of key issues before we head back to Washington. Congressman, thanks for being with us. Let's start with the bill that you've introduced about coding, and this is a fairly inside baseball thing. If I can boil it down, it seems like basically what this bill tries to do is keep small rural hospitals from being penalized if they mess up somewhere along the line in paperwork.
Right. What's happened is the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare, or Medicare and Medicaid Services, has implemented a new requirement for coding that's forcing doctors to go from a little over 16,000 codes to over 63,000 codes. And a lot of these small physician practices, even in some of the suburban areas, and these smaller hospitals are not prepared for it. And CMS has sent them notification that if they're not ready, they need to get a 6-month line of credit, because if they miscode something, they won't get reimbursed. Well, the vast majority of their patients are Medicare and Medicaid patients. So my concern is that these patients are going to lose access to health care in their communities. So I introduced a bill that would give a 2-year grace period, so that as they're trying to adapt to the new codes, if they make a mistake, they will not be penalized by having the reimbursement withheld. If we don't do that, I'm afraid that a lot of these physician practices and a lot of these rural hospitals are going to close, and you're going to have people in Marion County or Perry County that are going to have to drive 2 hours at least to find a hospital or to see a doctor.
What do you think the chances of passage are, given all the other things that are on the legislative calendar there?
I think the chances are pretty good. We've got over 40 co-sponsors right now. Key committee chairmen have co-sponsored. And plus, the American Medical Association has come out for this. They think this is a reasonable thing to do, and the Medical Association state of Alabama. And we're seeing other medical associations around the country come out in support of it as well. So key is to get information out to people so that they know what's going on. They can contact their members of Congress and let them know, and get the doctors informed about it. And it really does help the doctors focus on taking care of the patient and not be so worried about how they code something and being fearful they won't get paid.
Patients, not paperwork, in other words, right?
That's a great line. I wish I thought of that.
That's right. You can have that one for
Yeah.
free. Let's talk about the trade agreement out there that's caused a lot of controversy. You have Democrats defying President Obama. You have a lot of House Republicans coming out to try and support him on this. Where do you stand on the Trans-Pacific Partnership?
Well, I'm for trade. I'm for fair trade, but in this case, I voted against the Trade Promotion Authority and the Trade Authorization Authority, and I've read the entire TPA bill, Trade Promotion Authority bill, and I've read key parts of TPP. And if someone's wondering why I haven't read the whole TPP, it's locked up in a room in the basement of the Capitol. You have to make an appointment. You have to turn over your cell phone. You can't take notes, and the whole bill hasn't been written yet. But I've gone in and read key parts of it, and I've got some real concerns about protecting the sovereignty of the United States. I've got concerns about how much additional power to give the president, and I've got concerns that in terms of being able to, as a member of Congress, being able to review these trade agreements in process rather than waiting till they're finalized and then having to vote up or down on the whole package. I think we'd be far better off if the members of Congress were able to look at these agreements as they're being developed, so that if we got a problem with something, we resolve that right at that point, rather than wait till we get to the end and you've got 80% of the trade agreement you really like, but that 20% is really bad, and you either dump the whole thing or you have to take what they deliver. So I got a problem with that. I also have some concerns from the TPA perspective that there's not enough protection for cybersecurity. And that would come under the protections for intellectual property rights. And we're all hearing about now the latest cyber attack, the exposure that's not just the exposure that the government has, but the private sector as well. I think we ought to have some language that says that any nation that engages in cyber attacks against the United States, whether it's a government entity or a private sector, would be excluded from a trade agreement, or at very least have sanctions imposed.
And let's talk about what my final question is about that very subject, cybersecurity. I know you were on a subcommittee that dealt with a lot of the OPM breach. The federal employees got a lot of their data compromised, maybe all federal employees from what we're learning now. And we're talking millions of people out there who have connections to the federal government, who have Social Security numbers and credit cards and other things out there that are just floating around in cyberspace.
Well, I'm on the Oversight and Government Reform Committee, and we had this hearing last week, had Ms. Archuleta in, who's the head of the Office of Personnel Management, and her assistant director, Donna Seymour. And I asked, because, you know, the initial report was it only applied to about 4 million federal employees who had worked in the executive branch at some point and had filled out what's known as Standard Form 86. That's your background check. And I asked in the hearing whether or not this extended beyond those folks who had filled out a Standard Form 86. And Ms. Summer replied that was under investigation. And my response was, well, that's interesting, considering that 2 of my staff who've never worked in the executive branch, who've never filled out a Standard Form 86, both got letters from her, signed by her, telling them that their data had been exposed. And then I asked her again, and she said, well, yes. So this has gone much broader than they initially said. Plus, and this is the thing that I just can't believe, they didn't encrypt things like Social Security numbers. They left those exposed. So I think what you're going to see is that every member, Democrat and Republican, on the Oversight Committee is going to sign a letter calling for the resignation of Ms. Archuleta and Ms. Seymour. And there'll be some other things coming out, I think, a little bit later. But it really is something that we all ought to be concerned about. And I think we need to address that as a policy of the United States, not necessarily just a trade policy, but just a policy of the United States, that there's got to be some consequences for engaging in these kind of attacks.
Because the theory is that this was the Chinese government or somebody connected to it that was trying to gather and sort of collect all these numbers. And by the way, even if your number wasn't collected as a taxpayer, you may have to foot the bill for identity protection for the federal employees whose data was compromised.
Well, it's amazing to me that this is going on. It's not like it started last week. It's been going on for years. And yet we haven't upgraded our hardware. We haven't. We've taken months and years to try to implement software protections. And this is one of those things. I was talking to a couple of guys on the committee. It's almost like a NASCAR race. You blow an engine. Well, you don't start trying to repair the engine. You pull the engine, put a new one in. And that's really where I think we are right now, is that our software, our systems have been compromised. It's also interesting to note that the Federal Employees Union had a role in this. The Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, ICE, had sent a directive to their employees telling them that they could no longer use the federal system to access their personal emails. Most businesses don't allow that because that's how viruses get into the system. And the union, someone filed a grievance saying that was a benefit that had to be collectively bargained. And the arbitrator ruled in favor of the union and would not allow ICE to execute that directive. And as a result, it appears that one of the breaches was through a personal email account. So I think we've got to, this ought to be one of our top priorities in the federal government, is to look at this whole system. And if we need to replace it, we need to replace it now, not 2 years from now.
Excellent. Congressman Palmer, thank you for your time. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, John.